To understand the design of a grazing pasture system, it's good first to analyse what a natural grassland system looks like and to break down the properties of that system so that we can best replicate that kind of habitat in our own pasture systems, particularly in relevance to the particular grazers we want, and how we diversify that with most suitable tree crops. So if we have a look at grasslands in general, they tend to be quite extreme environments that they come from. So either they get very cold winters, such as the Mongolian highland habitats, or they get hot dry summers like the Sahara and the savannas associated with that around Africa. And in combination with either that cold or the fire, you get often you get a grazing pressure, so you get a mobile movement of grazers through that landscape, and their impact in association with the climate helps repress the succession of that landscape into trees. So over time, if there wasn't that disturbance, that landscape would slowly get colonized by pioneer species and shrubs and more weedy trees, and then you get more later climax kind of forest type trees. But that succession stage is being checked at an early stage of development by a combination of cold winters and fires and grazing pressures that maintains a particular ecosystem that you call a grassland. And that's a system where there's a dominance of plants, normally grasses, that have adapted to that high disturbance regime, and they're the ones that are most able to carry out their life cycles and occupy that niche and that habitat in the presence of that continuous disturbance that's impacted upon it. But there's diversity in that system too, so it's not just a swath of one type of grass. There's always a variety of different grasses that are adapted to that climate, and you'll get a fluctuation in grasses depending on changes in the grazers that are moving through it, or changes in the particular climate from year to year. You'd get more drought tolerant grasses, or more grasses that are more succulent, that are more adapted to a wetter environment. You get grasses that are more palatable, that would be eaten if there's a high grazing pressure, or you get them to disappear if there was too much grazing in that particular area. So it depends on the particular dynamics of those factors at that site would determine what combination of grasses you would get at that site. And in addition to the grasses, you also get pasture type herbs in these systems too. So they're either pioneer nitrogen fixating herbs, or plants that are able to draw up nutrients from deeper in the ground. So they're all plants like grasses that are adapted to an environment of high disturbance, but they've got other types of ways of dealing with that high rate of disturbance by either making the most use of the minerals or nutrients that are in that site, or as in the case of nitrogen fixating plants, to be able to produce their own. And you also get forested habitats too, so often in the gullies of those habitats, or where it gets steeper and the grazing pressure is less, or it's wetter, so you might get trees forming around little pond areas or streams or rivers, or areas where water's collected, or just wetter areas in the habitat, such as the gullies of a more mountainous or just rolling terrain. And in those types of habitats, the environmental conditions are less extreme, and maybe there's not so much pressure from the browsers as well, and that allows that habitat to demonstrate a later succession of plants. So you get all the weedy pioneer species and small pioneer trees, and then the more forest type trees able to establish that development in that ecosystem in those areas where there's less extremes in climate. So some of the other characteristics of a grassland are the seasonal patterns. So generally a drought in the summer that stresses the plants and favours the more fire adapted grasses that are able to regrow after being burnt more easily than other plants. The other characteristic is a high rate of carbon to the soil. So in a forest system, most of the carbon in that system is actually in that forest, so in the trees and other plants that live above ground. But in a grassland system, you get all of the photosynthesizing plants busy photosynthesizing and producing biomass in their growth and producing a big root system, and they're getting browsed, and all that carbon's being returned to the soil as a manure. So in those types of systems, you get a lot of carbon being stored in the soil, and that soil builds up in richness and depth over time. So all around the world, the most rich soils are actually found in grassland systems. Most commonly around the Midwest of the United States. Those areas were traditionally grassland type systems, and over hundreds of thousands of years after the glaciers retreated, they built up in carbon richness in those soils. And the last point is with that mobile movement of the grazers in that landscape, you don't get a continuous impact of a grazer on a particular site. So that site has an opportunity to recover and for the grasses and other herbs and trees to regrow before they're being grazed again as the grazers move back through that landscape. So it's helping understand these dynamics that are in a grassland will help inform us better as to how we can design our own pasture systems in a way that's best aligned with the properties in which those ecosystems work in nature.